an example using straight hairline and widow's peak. So straight hairline is recessive to widow's peak. The frequency of straight hairline in a particular population is 0.35. So let's stop right there and look at and interpret what we are given. The first thing you need to ask yourself is, are you given an allele frequency or a phenotype frequency? Our problem says the frequency of straight hairline. This is a phenotype. Okay, so if we look back at our problem, our equation, 2p, p squared plus 2pq plus q squared equals 1. The phenotype frequency of the recessive is q squared. So we're told that straight hairline is recessive, and so we're going to start with q squared because this is a phenotype frequency of the homozygous recessive genotype. So we are given that q squared is equal to 0.35. What is the allele frequency of the straight hairline trait? Now, an allele frequency tells us that we're going to be using P or Q. So if we are asked what is the allele frequency, we need to calculate P or Q. Now we're given Q squared. From that, we can calculate Q. Q is just going to be the square root of our Q squared value. So Q is equal to square root of 0.35, which means that Q is equal to 0.59. This is the allele frequency of the straight hairline allele. The next thing we need to do is determine the value of P. So we are almost always going to need to determine the value of both. So let's go ahead and just do that. If Q is equal to 0.59, we can use the equation P plus Q equals 1 to calculate P. So P is going to be equal to 1 minus Q. So P is equal to 1 minus 0.59. So P is equal to 0.41. This is an allele frequency for widow's peak. The second part of our question is, what is the frequency of widow's peak in the population? Let's go back to our HardyWeinberg equation. Now this Q squared, this is our straight hairline population, which means the rest of these guys are our widow's peak. So let's use this information to determine how frequently widow's peak occurs in our population. So we need to calculate P squared, which is going to be equal to 0.41 squared. So the frequency of homozygous dominant individuals in our population is 0.17. I'm going to freehand homozygous dominant phenotype and genotype. The other individuals in our population that display the widow's peak are the carriers, or the heterozygotes. That's represented by 2pq. So again, we'll just plug everything in. 2 times 0.41 times 0.59. This means that 0.48 or 48% of our population are heterozygous individuals. So these are heterozygous individuals with the dominant phenotype, the widow's peak phenotype. So in this case, we've just used our HardyWeinberg equation to determine some genotype frequencies. We were given Q squared originally, so we know how many individuals were originally homozygous recessive. Which is also the recessive phenotype. So we know what proportion of our population should have each of these different genotypes. Now you might use this if you're trying to analyze population and determine whether or not evolution is occurring, but our question here is just asking for frequencies.